said I would have never been able to have gone through school if it hadn't been that I left God, left Christ within me, do it through me and in me. And we know that he graduated with such high honors in science, which showed that our mind was all right, that they offered him a chair in Iowa State University, which would have been an easy life. It would have been a life of recognition why he was somebody. But he said, I remembered the South was still poor. The South hadn't yet come out of its poverty and need. And I knew that I owed a debt to the South. So he gave that up and went back south and gave his life to help bring the Southland back into prosperity. No one on earth ever did as much to bring the Southland back to prosperity as Dr. George Washington Carver. But when I tried to tell him how grateful I was for all the things he'd made out of the sweet potato and the peanut, because the land was so poor and they couldn't afford fertilizer, and about the only things they could raise in that poor land were sweet potatoes and peanuts. And he said all I did would take these things out and say, Lord, this is what they have. Show me what to do with it. That you can bring prosperity back to the South. And he said, everything you saw in that museum, God told me just what to do. I only obey it. Healing is a very vital part of the Christian ministry. It certainly was vital all through the Bible time. It certainly was a very vital part of the early church. Everyone took hold of these great powers that were offered and used them. I don't know why we've ever let it slide. Of course, we do have marvelous doctors, and we certainly do expect to use them. God expects us to use all the things that he's given us. And he's given us wonderful doctors, wonderful medical science, wonderful miracle drugs. He expects us to use them. But you know, the things that you're most afraid of are the diseases, are the infirmities that get beyond medical science. And we know there are many things that medical science cannot take care of. But we do know, and it is our doctors that have made us know this, that these diseases and infirmities that get beyond medical science are things that first happen in the mind or the emotions or the spirit of man. And there isn't any surgeon or any doctor that can change your emotions, that can turn your resentment into forgiveness, or your hatreds into love, or your fears into faith, or any of these destructive emotions into the ones that overcome. But we do have marvelous doctors today, psychosomatic doctors, that know what all of these wrong attitudes and wrong emotions lead to. When you go to them with one of these so-called incurable diseases, they know what to look for. They know how to help you face these things and overcome them and meet them gloriously. And none of them are incurable. Not one of them. There isn't anything that God cannot cure. Jesus cured everyone. He brought the dead back to life. And when he sent out the 12 and the 70, he sent them out to preach the good news of the kingdom, to cast out demons, to cleanse the lepers, and heal the sick and raise the dead. And he's never recalled that. And we are his disciples. So as we're going to be sufficient for the day in which we're living, and it is a great and mighty day, we have entered a new era in history. We are now living in the great spiritual age. Our wonderful scientific age that we are passing through and have been passing through all during the 20th century has only been a preparation for this great spiritual age that we entered on the 4th day of February, when God announced the new age with 7 stars, all backing each other with the sevenfold illumination showing through one star. I wish it had been visible in our part of the world. It was not visible here, but it was visible on the other side of the world. But we knew it was happening. You didn't turn on your radio for months before the 4th of February that you didn't hear something about it being doomsday and the world was coming to an end and all kinds of terrible things were going to happen because of this great thing that was lining up. Well, many of us knew that it was not doomsday, but it was proclaiming the new spiritual age that everyone's been looking for, if you've been thinking, if you've been spending any time in prayer and listening rather than doing all the talking. But most of us seem to think when you pray, you just do all the talking and make God do the listening. And God cannot answer unless you're going to do the listening. Every time you bring anything to God in prayer, if you release the problem, give it to Him and listen, He'll show you the answer. He'll lead you into the answer. He always has the answer available. And His answer is always sufficient. But God has given us a free will. He never makes us listen and obey. We have to do as Jesus did. Now, Jesus made time to be alone with God and listen. And it was much harder for Jesus to find that time than it is for you and me. For there's always some place where you and I can slip away and be alone, usually in our own home. But that wasn't true of Jesus. He had no home. And where he was, there was 12 other men with him, doubtless all sleeping on the floor in the same room. For most people in Palestine, the poor people, they sleep right on the floor. They have no furniture. And so Jesus doubtless spent most of his ministry sleeping on the floor with 12 men around him. Now, to be alone with God and be able to hear God speak and be sensitive to what God wanted to give him and show him, he had to slip off a long while before day to some desert place, some mountainside, somewhere that he could be alone and quiet and listen. I'm sure that Jesus didn't do the talking when he slipped away to meet with his Father. He knew that God knew everything he'd done, every desire in his heart. He knew that the Father knew what he was going to face that coming day. He knew that the Father was abundantly able to prepare him for every moment of the day. And he slipped away in order to be prepared and ready and listen. That's where we fail in prayer, most of us. We do all the talking, and we do not get the answer, for we haven't taken time to listen. And if we've listened, we do not always obey. Now, since prayer is so utterly essential for this great, new, wonderful day in which we are living, the day in which the kingdom is going to be made real on earth, and we, the chosen civilization that God has prepared for today, are going to finish that great commission to go into all the world and carry the good news to every creature, or we will fail, even as all the other great civilizations have failed. But I don't think we're going down. I have been around the whole world. I've been to most of the nations. I have certainly been in every part of this nation many times. And I have watched our churches awakening. You wouldn't hardly talk about healing in a church as freely as I'm talking tonight. 10 years ago, just wasn't done. You had to go to a camp or some special place to talk about healing. But today, our top leaders know that healing is a very vital part of the ministry of Jesus. If we're going to be ready to get the good news to the end of the earth, the vital part of that good news is ministering to the human needs of every man. That was how Jesus did it. He was out where the multitudes were, and he ministered to every human need, that he might reach into those deeper needs, for the deeper needs lie behind the human needs. These human needs are only evidence of a deeper need in our lives. But most of us aren't aware of the deeper needs. We are very much aware of a sick body, of a troubled mind, of a being worried over something that seems impossible and desperate. Jesus has the answer to every one of them. Now it seems that all my life the Lord has been training me in the art of prayer, and prayer is an art. It is something that works by spiritual laws that must be recognized. They must be met in order to get the answers. But they're so simple that anyone can learn the art of prayer. A little child, an illiterate, anyone can learn the art of prayer, and anyone can find the answers to prayer. We never fail because we can't. We always fail because we didn't know. But today we must know. Now I talked this afternoon about prayer, so I'm just going to say to you, if you do not know these simple laws of prayer, we have a set of books back there, 9 little 25-cent booklets on prayer, and the complete set is only $2. I don't believe there's anything you need to know about prayer that you would not find in those 9 little 25-cent booklets. And then we have another set of books, which we call the Abundant Life series, that after you've learned these laws of prayer, it teaches you how to just live it. You don't have to stop and think of the conditions in prayer. They're so natural, they're as natural as breathing. All you do is just live it. And when you're living these laws of prayer, God is using you when you have no idea you're being used. Whenever your life is yielded to Him and you're living relaxed and free and confident and loving and kind and outgoing, God is using you whether you have any idea of it or not. And so you'll need, if you really mean business in this life, you'll need to know how to just live it. Just breathe it. I have here in the pulpit one of the little dollar sets for the abundant life that teaches you how to just live it at all times. It's called the Abundant Life series. That's $1.25 worth for $1. But it'll make a great change in your life. Not just to others, but to yourself. You know, you have to live with yourself through all eternity. So it's a mighty good idea to be the kind of a self you like to live with. That will show you how. Now, rather than talk more on these laws of prayer, I think I'm going to tell you I'm going to tell you a story that will show you how essential it is to know these laws, and then knowing them, you must obey them. For to know them and not to obey them is worse than not to know them. Now, in about 1939, a new suburb was opened up in Norfolk, Virginia, where 5 great rivers in the Chesapeake Bay all flow into the Atlantic Ocean. And so Norfolk has rivers everywhere. And one of these new subdivisions was a little oval-shaped plot of land where there could be about 20 waterfront sites. And all of them faced the water, and then in the center of the back of each was a nice park where the children could play. Now it was connected with other land by something no wider than this sanctuary, just wide enough for a street to go in. And the waterfront drive go round in front of the home. Nothing to hurt the children in the rear of the home. It was a very desirable place. Now the first one to buy a site out there was the Dix family, D-I-X. He was a naval officer of high rank, and they were so pleased with their waterfront site that Patty, the wife, said, wouldn't it be lovely if we could just sell these sites to our friends and have this whole community, just a nice little community of our close friends. Well, he thought that was a good idea, so they began to invite their friends out to see their new site and their new home going up, and pretty soon every site out there had been bought by people in the service, their friends. And so it became a very happy community. Now, they were all very nice people. Every one of them belonged to some church. Most of them went to Sunday school. They were always active in Sunday school and church. In Norfolk, Tuesday is church day. All churches of all denominations have their women's meetings on Tuesday. And so country clubs and the garden clubs and other clubs do not meet on Tuesday. That is church day. You know, it's a very good idea. For it really gives women one day when they belong to the church and you don't let other things interfere. Now, they observed church day. They all went to their church days. But all the rest of the week, they had parties. Parties every day. Well, they were young, and they were able to have a maid and 2 cars, and so there wasn't any reason why they shouldn't enjoy life. Patty was the center of all of their social life. Everybody revolved around Patty, and she was a delightful person. But Patty began to have very severe headaches. Oh, she didn't have time to have a headache, so she wouldn't think of stopping for a headache. So she'd take an extra aspirin or whatever she had and keep going. But finally, one morning, she couldn't lift that head off her pillow. And so she said to her husband, this old headache has me this morning. I guess you'd better call a doctor. And so he called a doctor and went on to the naval base thinking you don't stop for a headache. But when the doctor came and examined her, he knew it was a tumor on the brain. And he felt that it was rather far advanced. So before he even called the husband home, he called Dr. Dandy of Johns Hopkins Hospital, who is reputed to be the best brain specialist in the East, and made an appointment for Patty to be examined the next morning. Then he called the husband and told him to come home. He came home and he said, you're taking your wife to Baltimore. I have an appointment with Dr. Dandy, the brain specialist, in the morning. Your wife will need some brain surgery, tumor on the brain. Well, young, you know, you've never had any trouble. You don't look for the worst. And so they told the community goodbye. They'd be back in a few days and left. But Patty was sewed up inoperable. The tumor had advanced so there was nothing could be done. And Dr. Dandy said to her husband, don't let her have any company. She's going to need all the strength that she has for herself. All I can do is give you dope. I'll give you an unlimited amount, but don't start it too soon. For her last days are going to need all that she can have. So hold off the dope just as long as possible. That's all that can be done. Well, you can imagine what happened in that community when Patty came home with the death warrant. Nobody went to parties anymore. They just sat around and wept. They couldn't even go in to see her. And so they were all weeping together one day, a few days later, when Patty's sister-in-law, one of my spiritual life secretaries on another district, heard about Patty and came to see her. And when she saw all of her friends sitting around weeping instead of praying, she said, what's the matter with you girls? Why aren't you out praying? What are you doing weeping? Weeping isn't going to help. They said, praying. Do you realize what Dr. Dandy said about Patty? She said, of course I do. That's why I'm here. They said, do you think that God could help her in her condition? Well, she said, I know it, or I wouldn't be here. Well, they said, we don't know how to pray like that. Well, she said, you know, You're in Norfolk. Don't you remember just a couple years ago, Dr. Walter Gum, of course he's Bishop Walter Gum today, don't you remember his condition? Why, he was much more dangerously ill and nearer death than Patty is. His is a world record, been written up in every medical magazine around the world. Carried a temperature of 108 degrees for 10 days without it wavering. No one else in the world has lived that carried a temperature of 108 degrees for 10 days straight running that's ever been known. So she said, don't you remember that? They said, oh, yes, but he's a preacher. You see, they thought God would do something for a preacher he wouldn't do for an ordinary person. She said, that has nothing to do with it. God is just as eager to help the least and the lowest and the most sinful as Walter Gum. Well, they said, we don't know how to pray like that. Well, she said, don't you know the one that led the prayer group lives in Norfolk? Why don't you call her? And she called my name, and one of them said, oh, I know her. But she said, get in touch with her. Ask her if she'll teach you how to pray. So they called me up and asked if I would teach them how to pray. And I said, well, come in and let's talk it over. Well, about 40 of them descended upon me. And they told me about the case, and they said, do you think Patty could live? And I said, I don't have to think. I know Patty could live. Why, she's a young person. She has a couple young children. You don't think she's finished her life work, do you? And if she hasn't, why, all power in heaven and earth is backing her to bring her back to perfect wholeness. But I said, you know, it isn't something that's cheap and easy. Do you know what we did in order to be a channel for our minister, Dr. Gum? They said, no, but we'd do anything in the world to save Patty's life. Well, I said, Dr. Gum went to the hospital on the 6th day of December. And our prayer groups met every single morning. From the morning he went, and they announced that it was absolutely a hopeless case. We met every single morning to take a promise. Well, that's the way we learned how to pray. You find the conditions of prayer in the promises. There isn't one promise in the Bible that says if you just beg God long enough and keep on begging, you'll break him down and he'll do what you want. Prayer has never yet lowered God's standard. Prayer has never yet changed God's will. For God's will is always to give you the best, to give you everything that's right and good and perfect and satisfying. Prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes us. And so I said every day we met and we'd take another one of Jesus' promises. We'd look within these promises to see what we had to do before we could claim the promises. And then we'd examine ourselves to see if we were meeting those conditions. And if we were, we'd just thank him that we were doing our best to meet those conditions, and if he'd show us more to do, we'd do anything he showed us. And we were accepting his word and staking our lives upon it and thanking him. Now, the only prayer that has power is a prayer of gratitude and praise and adoration and rejoicing. Read your Psalms. They are filled with beautiful, powerful prayers. Praise ye the Lord. When you are praising God, when you're adoring him, when you're thanking him and knowing that he wants this more than you, you're giving God the material to answer with. So I said, now every day we met and let the Holy Spirit convict us if we were not measuring up. And when we were, we accepted it, we adored him, we thanked him, we praised him, and rejoiced that we could stake our lives on it and he would not fail. Now, after Walter Gum had held this temperature for a full week without it lowering at all, the doctors, who had seen many miracles happen when this prayer group was praying, sent us word not to pray any longer. that if he lived, his brain wouldn't be any good, that anyone that had carried a temperature that high, that long, his mind would not be right. So we told the doctor that sent us that word that we weren't telling God how to answer. We never do. You'd limit him if you tried to tell him how to answer. You can just absolutely say, thy will be done, for everything that Jesus did was God's will. So we said, now we're not telling God how to answer, and we know that God, if he has his will wouldn't be to save that wonderful minister and not let him have a mind. So we are going to continue to offer God a channel to do his will. On the 10th day, his temperature fell down to normal, and every symptom within him became normal. He was back in his pulpit the last of January. But we continued to meet every day to rejoice and give thanks and praise and adore him until he was back in his own pulpit. He's Bishop Walter Gum today at the two Kentucky conferences, and I hope that you're going to hear him someday and you can judge whether his mind's all right. You won't find a much more sparkling mind than Walter Gum's mind. So I told him that, and I said, are you all ready to meet every day, to learn these conditions of prayer, to examine yourselves and measure up and obey and be a channel for God to use to bless Patty? They said, Miss Eggleston, we'd do anything under the sun to save Patty's life. I said, all right, now if you mean business, you go out and find out how many of her friends are willing to say, I'll put it first. I'll not do anything else at this hour. We'll select the hour, and they selected 2 o'clock each afternoon, and we were going to meet right across the parkway from Patty's house. She was on a hospital bed that was even with triple windows, and she could lie on the bed and see us meeting every day. So they met there deliberately so they could wave to her as they went in and let her know they were meeting to pray for her. Now I said, you find out how many people will pledge that they'll put this first. They will come and offer their very all to God to be a channel for him to heal Patty. And I said, and I'll go out and see Patty. And they said, oh, you can't see her. She's not having any company. Well, I said, maybe I can get in anyhow. You see, it hadn't been but a couple of years since I had had my second illness, and I was in the hospital 6 weeks. And when you're in the hospital 6 weeks, you come to know right many nurses. So I didn't think I'd have any trouble getting in. When I went out and rang the bell, though it was one of my very own nurses that opened the door. And she said, oh, I was just about to call you. Will you come in and have a prayer with Patty? And I said, well, I came for that reason. So I went up and met Patty, and I could see why they were ready to make a sacrifice. She was just lovely. When I told her that her friends were going to meet every day, they weren't going to have the card parties now. They were just going to have a prayer party instead and going to learn how to pray and be a channel for her so that God could bring her back to perfect wholeness. Well, we had a wonderful time, and I said, now I'm going to really teach them their Bible. I'm going to let them know how to pray, and they're going to discover it for themselves as they search the chapters that I give them and find out these conditions and then meet them. And the nurse said, well, now you give me the lesson each day, and I'll be teaching Patty while you teach them, and it'll be a wonderful experience. Well, I had a prayer with Patty and told her that we were going to begin the very next day at 2 o'clock. Well, each day I went out about 15 or 20 minutes ahead of time, and I'd see Patty and have a prayer with her, prayer of rejoicing. Then I'd go over and meet with them. From the first day we met, Patty never had another pain, and Patty was in great pain until the prayer group started to meet. God always takes all we offer. He uses everything we give him. And here they were, young, enthusiastic. All of them were young couples. And they were just giving their enthusiasm, and God ceased the pain. She'd never had another pain from the very first day we met. Well, I began giving them 5 or 6 chapters in one of the Gospels, and I said, now get yourself a nice big composition book. You're going to write every promise that you find in your promise book, and get yourself a nice colored pencil and underscore your part. Usually there's 2 things you must do before you can claim that promise. So as we'd come in with our promises, they were as thrilled as if they were having Christmas with these promises. They had underscored their part, and I'd talk about that part, and I said, now, God is faithful. If we're meeting our part, you can stake your life on God doing his part. Well, we just had the best time. We began meeting the last week in April, and we met every day in May, every day but Sunday. And I said, now, we won't meet on Sundays, but every one of us got to go to Sunday school and church. And Sunday school and church will take the place of the prayer group. Well, every day we had 40 signed up. And every day those 40 were right back. Well, we were having such a wonderful time, we hardly realized the summer had gone by, and not one of us had taken a vacation. Not one of us had accepted any invitation that would keep us from meeting in the afternoon at 2 o'clock. And no one considered it a sacrifice. They all said they never had as much fun in a card party in all their life as they were having, finding these wonderful promises. Well, after a week or so, they said, Miss Eggleston, couldn't you give each of us a different assignment? And let each of us find different promises, and then we could help each other get their book filled. And, well, when they came trading promises, you thought it was Christmas Day, exchanging Christmas presents. They just rejoiced over these promises. But every day I made them look at the conditions. These are the things that God requires of us. And when we meet that, you may be very sure God is doing it. Well, Patty seemingly was just all right, except she didn't gain her strength. She felt wonderful, but she didn't have the strength to walk the steps. But she was a little thing. Her husband just pick her up in his arms and take her down. She could eat as much dinner as anybody. He'd put her in the car. She could go driving. They could all come to see her. They could tell her everything they knew. Everything's fine, except she didn't get her strength. The doctors were just amazed. They didn't know what to make of it. She didn't have any symptoms of any tumor anymore, but just didn't get her strength. Well, this went on all of May and all of June and all of July and all of August, and now it had come up to the 3rd week in September. And now it was time for me to get out on my districts, for I was a conference spiritual life secretary. And you have to begin your fall work in September. I had all the districts to visit and lead retreats and get everybody else going. And I said, now, Father, I know with you there are no conflicts. I know there's never but one right answer to anything. There are thousands of wrong answers, but there's never but one right answer. Now, I said, I don't know whether I should give up my conference work or give up the prayer group. But you know, and whatever is right, I'm willing to do it. I love both. I love my conference work, and I've never enjoyed anything more than this group of enthusiastic young women. But I've got to give up one or the other. I have to get out on my district. So I said, now it's up to you, Lord. Any way you want it is all right with me. Well, the next day when I went by to see Patty, I never saw anybody look as beautiful in all my life as Patty looked. She looked more like an angel than a person. She was simply radiant, just a halo all around her. And I said, Patty, do you feel as wonderful as you look? She said, Miss Eggleston, I can't explain to you how I feel. She said, you know, in the upper room, Jesus talked about his peace. I said, yes. Well, she said, I know what he's talking about. I am filled so full of his peace that I can't even describe it. But it is something that's unspeakable. It's so wonderful. And she said, you remember he talked about his joy? And I said, yes, I remember that. Well, she said, I am so full of that joy that I can hardly stand it. It's simply wonderful. Well, I said, you certainly show it. I've never seen anybody look as beautiful and as radiant and as callous as you look. I know that this is your day when you're perfectly well. I know that tomorrow you're going to be able to meet with us. I'll not have a lesson today. I'll just go over and we'll just sing praises. Every hymn that gives the thanksgiving and praise and rejoicing, we're going to sing it. And I said, your windows are open, you can hear us, you lie here and sing with us. And she said, all right. So I gave a prayer of rejoicing and thanksgiving, and I went over. And I said, how many of you girls have hymn books? Oh, they all had a hymn book. We had every known denomination because lots of people besides Methodists, play cards. And so they went out and they brought in their hymn books, all the varieties. And we turned to the Thanksgiving hymns and we sang all the Thanksgiving hymns. Everything that rejoiced and had joy and gratitude, we sang it for 1 hour. And I said, now I know that tomorrow Patty is going to be with us. I said, now we'll take the lesson we were to have today. We'll just have that tomorrow. Today was just a day of rejoicing. Well, when I was ready to go home that evening, Juliet, who always had been coming out from the city in another car, said to me, I drive home with you this afternoon. I said, surely. So when we were seated, she said, I'm not sleeping at night. Well, I said, what are you worrying about, Juliet? For when you don't sleep at night, there's something eating you. There's something that's keeping you awake. Because if you're all relaxed and happy and peaceful and joyous and free, you just naturally go to sleep. And she said, that's what's the matter. I am worried about something. Well, I said, what are you worried about? You can't worry. That closes the channel to God. She said, did you know that Betty and I don't speak to each other? I said, you surely don't mean Betty in the prayer group. She said, I certainly do. Well, I said, Juliet, neither one of you missed a day this summer, have you? Nope, neither one of us. I said, and you haven't spoken in this prayer group when you knew the conditions? She said, we haven't spoken to each other for years. Well, I said, I see why Patty hasn't gained her strength. God could not possibly give the full victory unless we went the full way. Well, she said, I know it. That's why I can't sleep. Well, I said, what are you going to do about it, Juliet? She said, if you'll make her apologize, I'll forgive her. I said, well, Juliet, it looks to me like the Lord's talking to you and saying to you, you go and make it right. She said, I never will. She's the one that deliberately hurt me. And if she will apologize, I'll forgive her. But I will never make the first step. But I said, Juliet, don't you realize that if it was her fault, how much easier it would be for you to make the step than for her? Much easier, much bigger. I sat there and I begged and I pled with her. I tried to reason. I said, you know that Patty cannot possibly be well until we meet the conditions. You don't fool God. She said, I know it. And if you just make her come and apologize, it'll be all right. I said, but Juliet, God doesn't do it that way. He never coerces. He never makes us. He offers us everything, but he never forces. I said, I can't do that. The Lord is speaking to you. Won't you go and make the opening? She said, I'll never do it. Well, I said, it looks like we've wasted 5 months, doesn't it? No, she said, not if you'll make her come and apologize. Well, I left her adamant she wasn't going to be moved. When I got home, the maid said, there's a message for you. I said, what is it, Susie? She said, Patty Dix has died. And if she told me that every member of my family had been killed in a wreck, I don't think it would have hurt me anymore. And I'm sure it wouldn't have shocked me anymore. It had never occurred to me that all that halo, all that glory, all that peace and joy was death. That she had already died. Well, I forgot how to pray. You know, in the crises, we become ourselves, don't we? Well, I just reverted to the old type. And I went flying to that prayer room, and I said, Lord, how could you do it? How could you do it? Did you ever see a group more enthusiastic, more faithful? They just haven't missed a day this summer. They've given up vacations. They've given up everything. Didn't you know we were going to come through? Didn't you know we would face it? Oh, I was really talking to the Lord instead of listening. And then after I got the agony out of my soul, then I did come to myself and I said, oh, forgive me, Lord. You must feel much worse than I do. For after all, it wasn't my word I was teaching. It was your word. And they're going to say now, prayer doesn't work. What am I going to say? How can I face them? I don't know how I can face them. And I was honestly just broken-hearted. And the phone rang. And the maid said, it's for you, Miss Eggleston. I went to the phone. It wasn't Betty, and it wasn't Juliet. It was another one in the group. She said, have you heard about Patty? I said, yes. She said, you know, Miss Eggleston, it's my fault Patty died. I knew there was a condition I wasn't meeting, but I didn't think it was so important. I didn't think God would hardly notice it. Well, I said, were you going to admit it? Were you going to tell it? No, she said, I wasn't even going to tell it. Do you know that all but one in that group called me, each one admitting that she hadn't met all the conditions, and she knew it, and she had no idea of ever admitting it. They were enjoying it. They were having a better time than the card party. And somehow or other they had an idea God's so good and so merciful and so forgiving and so lenient that he wouldn't notice one little omission. How they learned their lesson. It was the saddest group, I guess, that ever did attend a funeral. For they knew that they had failed. They knew it wasn't God that failed. They knew that Patty was sacrificed for their failure. And I tell you, that was a sad group. But after the funeral was over, they said, you aren't going to give us up, are you? Well, I said, I'd hate to. I've just learned to love you like my own children. And if you want to, and if you're ready now to be faithful and go all the way, oh, how the Lord can use you now. For you know that you don't fool the Lord. He can really make you into a wonderful group now. And I said, we'll meet once a week. But I've been coming to the suburbs every day. How about you all coming in town? And there was a number of cars coming out from the town. They said, we'll do anything if you'll just keep us. I said, all right, we'll meet at Ghent Methodist Church. You select the day. So they decided on Thursday morning, 10:30. There hasn't been a Thursday morning at 10:30, unless it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, that you won't find that group in Ghent Methodist Church meeting. You'll find from 60 to 100 instead of 40. But if you were to attend it today, you'd find there isn't but one person in it today that was in it then. They were all in the service, and the Lord has flung them all over the world. And everywhere they've gone teaching prayer, having prayer groups. Oh, the Lord has a marvelous way of spreading. You know, the only one that's still left is the one that wasn't trying to fool God. She's still living there. She's still a member of the group. Well, when we met the first Thursday, now I could take care of my district work because I still had a family and I didn't stay away a week at a time then. I could go out and take care of a district and come back home, but I could always plan it to be home on Thursday. It was maid's day off anyhow, you know, so it was the right day to be home. Well, the first day we met, they said, Miss Eggleston, we've got to make up for Patty, haven't we? I said, I think so. They said, don't you think we ought to support a missionary? We used to spend an awful lot on our card parties. Don't you think it'd be nice if every week we'd bring what we would have spent on a party or anything else we can save? Couldn't we support a missionary? I said we certainly could. Well, with as many Baptists as Methodists, and as many Episcopalians as Methodists, and Lutherans, and Presbyterians, and Christian Disciples, and Congregationalists, and all the others. You couldn't support a Methodist missionary. But I knew some that were out in the field by faith. This was long before Koinonia came into being. But the worldwide evangelization crusade missionaries are out in the fields by faith. So we began supporting a missionary family in Africa. That was just the beginning. Oh, the people that we have supported. We took up a little later on another one, a literacy missionary, $3,000 a year. That's when we had to write our book. Because we knew we just couldn't keep on picking up thousands of dollars from not having card parties. So we had to write our little books and sell them, and all the proceeds from our books go to these missionary endeavors. Patty Dix has served the world 1,000-fold more than she would have if she'd lived. That's how wonderful God is. He takes the tragedies and makes them into something bigger and more wonderful. And Mr. Dix found another awfully nice person. And Patty's little children have a nice mother, so the Lord takes care of all the details. He really used that in a glorious way. Well, now we began in 1940, this was now, by the time that group was going. And now the war was on. And Norfolk, you know, is a war city. All the things of war centered around in Norfolk. And that's where epidemics are. You know, our greatest epidemics are always during war times and in war centers. And a polio epidemic broke out in Norfolk. And when we met one day, and we hadn't been meeting on Thursdays too long when this happened, 5 cases of polio, complete paralysis, were reported in our one meeting, and all of them had a close connection with someone in that group. Every case was considered complete paralysis and no hope of them ever being any better. Well, we really were put on the spot. So we turned that whole time into prayer and examining ourselves to be a channel. But I knew that anything that big and that much took more than 1 hour or so of prayer. And I said, you know, when Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, the 9 disciples had tried to heal this epileptic boy and had failed. But Jesus healed him. And then they wanted to know why it was that they had failed. And Jesus said, this kind goeth out only by prayer and fasting. Now, I said, I've never tried this. But how many of you would like to spend the whole day here in our sanctuary in prayer and fasting? Well, 30 hands went up. And I thought, well, now I wonder if these 30 new recruits are really ready for anything quite that deep. And I knew that the power of prayer depends upon perfect harmony, perfect oneness of spirit. It's much better to have a smaller group where they're totally committed and giving God everything than a big group with 1 or 2 that are failing in some spot. So I said, now let's face this. I'd much rather you wouldn't come unless you're willing to just go all the way. If you have any doubt in the world that God doesn't want to make every one of these 5 every whit whole, and that he's going to do it, if we can come and be a channel that's completely committed, letting him convict us if there's anything in us less than he would have it. And we're not going to have anything solid. Now you can have some broth or juice or milk, and you can bring some with you for the middle of the day. But tomorrow is one day we're going to have free from any solid food. We're not going to give any of our life forces to the human functions. We're going to give everything to God tomorrow. Now, how many really want to come under those circumstances? And the 30 hands went up again. I said, all right, I'll meet you in the sanctuary tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. The 30 were there. I said, bring your Bible, bring your favorite devotional books, because we're all going to be thinking the same thoughts at the same time. You know, there's great, great power when everyone's thinking the same thought at the same time. It's like an army marching. You know, when an army marches and every foot hits at the same time, there isn't a bridge in the world that will let an army march over it in step. For the rhythm of it would shake any bridge off its foundation. Now, when a group like this is meeting together, thinking the same thoughts at the same time, all in tune with each other, with God, and love toward their neighbors, why, it's powerful enough to change anything. Well, they were all there. They all brought their Bibles, and they all brought their favorite devotional books. Now, we spent the first half hour around the altar. I remember when we assembled and started toward that altar, one of the members was a very, very staunch Southern Baptist. And they don't have altars. And they don't go up and kneel at altars. And the very thought of it made her faint. She just fell right out in a dead faint. Before we got to pray for the others, we had to bring her back to life. Just the very thought of going and kneeling at a Methodist altar was against everything that she'd ever been taught. But she came through, and oh, she made a wonderful one. It was all right. It was a very good test for us. Well, that first half hour, we were kneeling at the altar in silence. Each of us, I would call out the conditions, and we would each face ourselves in the light of that, asking the Holy Spirit to convict us if we weren't measuring up. If there was one thing in us that was breaking that law, to make us know it. And if we knew it, all we had to do is give it back to Him. He'd already paid the price in full for every sin to be redeemed. And all we had to do was accept it and thank it and take hold of it. Well, we went through these, and then I said, now let's each one offer ourselves anew to God. And we just each made a prayer of surrender. Then we went and sat together and took turns leading the thinking. I did most of it, but I let them all have their chance. You know, there's some marvelous devotional books. Do you use God Calling? I've been using it ever since 1930. It's just as fresh today as it was in 1930. It always seems to meet the needs of the day, but we always use it when we have a day like this. For, oh, there's so many, many things in there, and it's just as inspired as the Bible. It was written the same way. The Holy Spirit speaking through people that were committed to Him. Well, we had a wonderful time. Now, one thing we do when we're there to pray for some case like this, we see that the person knows we are praying for them. They know that this group is there in the sanctuary offering their lives as a channel for God to heal you. Now, that person must receive it. God can sweep all of His power through us, even as He did through Jesus. But the person we're praying for must receive it. So they must know we're praying. Now, each of these five knew that we were there in the church offering our lives to God for their healing. Well, one of these that was the total paralysis was the daughter of Betty. Oh, I'd failed to tell you that Betty and Juliet are inseparable. Yeah, I don't know which one rushed to each other first, but there wasn't any who did it first there. They both just dashed into each other's arms. Now, this was Betty. Now, Betty's lovely young daughter, and she was a lovely young daughter, was in college, and her fiancé had to go to war. So they begged the mother and father to let them be married before he went. And she would go right on to school and finish college, and everything would be just the same. So they got married, and he went off to war, but she had a little baby. And so now she was a little baby, a couple months old, was one of the polio victims, total paralysis. Betty had the grandbaby. But Jeannie knew that we were meeting to be a channel for her. Now, Jeannie was a girl with great faith, just a lovely soul. So that morning, knowing that we were there in the sanctuary praying for her, she was expecting something wonderful to happen. So she said to her nurse that morning, would you mind getting some crutches and standing by my bed so I could look at them? The nurse said, Jeannie, there's no use of you having any false hope. You'll never be able to walk, not even on crutches. So there's no need of me getting crutches and putting them here and giving you a false hope. But she said, if I want to look at them, would you mind getting them and standing them there anyhow? Well, she said, if it do you any good to look at them, I'll get some crutches and stand them there. So the nurse got the crutches and stood them by her bed, and then Jeannie acted as though she had utterly forgotten it, as though that was completely out of her mind now. She waited an hour or so, wondering what she could send her nurse out to do that would take her an awful long time. So she thought of some book that she knew would not be in the library. And she said, would you mind going to the library and finding this book? There's something in it that I want you to read to me. Please look until you find it. Well, the nurse had to reluctantly say she'd go and find the book. She'd fixed her up. There was nothing she could do for her right there. So she sent her on this wild goose chase to find a book that wasn't. And as soon as she was out of the room, she said, now, Lord, you gave me a little baby. You gave me a husband. I know you don't want me here. I know that if Jesus walked in this room, he'd touch me. And I would arise and walk. And I know that Jesus is in this room. And in his name and in his power, I'm going to get up and walk. And she got up and got on those crutches. And when the nurse was coming back without the book, she met her coming down the hall, walking on the crutches. That happened that morning while we were praying. Now, the others didn't happen that fast, but all 5 came back without any signs whatsoever of ever having had any polio. And in every case, it had been pronounced total paralysis. Now, there isn't any limitation with God, but you don't fool God, and you don't give him halfway measures. You must go all the way with God. Now, you know, all the laws of life that you and I are living by are being broken upon, you find in the Sermon on the Mount. I heard Fritz Kunkel say many times that if we only had 3 chapters in the Bible, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, if we knew them, if we lived by them, everyone could live as Jesus lived. For every law of life you find in the Sermon on the Mount. But how many of you know it? How many follow it? Oh, you all know it. Just as familiar as can be. But we still criticize and we still condemn, don't we? We're not letting our light shine. He said, you're the salt of the earth. Are you? What is salt? Salt is no good at all unless it's lost. You never sat down in your life and ate a little dish of salt and said, this is the best salt I ever tasted, wonder what brand it is. You never just eat salt to be salt. Salt is no good until it's lost in something else. And everything it's lost in, you make it better. You say what nice soup this is, but you never say what nice salt you put in the soup. Well, that's what he's saying to Christians. You're the salt of the earth. You're here to be lost, to let your light shine and give light to others and spread my love everywhere. You know the central thing that Jesus taught? And it's given 6 times in practically the same words in the 4 Gospels, and then it's given the 7th time in mystical terms. Matthew gives it twice in the same words. Luke gives it twice in the same words. Mark gives it once. John gives it once, and then John gives it again in the mystical terms. And what is it? It's the law of life. If you would be my disciple, you must deny self. You must deny that human self. You must lose it. You must give it back to God. You must let it be salt.